CityCast from Explocity.
Maharaja. The word evokes powerful imageries. Erstwhile power, a silhouette of past glory, a medieval vestige, even, a glimmer blunted by the monochrome of contemporaneity. A Maharaja in today's world is thought of as a relic, a vestigial figure downed and drowned by colonial sovereignty, vanquished and defeated. He's imagined to have led a languid life, lurking around colorful corridors in vain. The history of history itself is testament to the fact that it's the handmaiden of the agendas that engender its documentation. The lives of Indian princes have indeed escaped respectful attention in the accounts of Indian history during colonial times. After all, one may ask, what can be remarkable about these vassals of the great British Empire? Why should the ruminations of history be bothered about these men who were free under colonial siege? Despite such stereotyping, if one delves deeper into the chronicles of princely kingdoms, many scholars, thinkers, composers, philosophers, and statesmen emerge from behind this veil of dismissal. His benefaction and love for music knew no boundaries. When the world was polling out monarchies, unfazed, Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar was designing the world's first ever music psychology based opinion poll with the Gramophone magazine and a British record label, the Electric and Musical Industries Limited, popularly known as EMI. The findings of this poll not only decided the roadmap for the Western classical music production giant, but also changed the course of what would eventually be recorded and adored in its history. But for his foresight, many breathtaking masterpieces of Western classical music embodying the Philharmonic spirit would never be available for posterity. Between 1946 and 1948, when most Rajas were twiddling their thumbs about how to wrestle power, our Maharaja was instead plumbing the depths of quiescent ragas to anchor his soul. When national chaos pervaded, a still music arose in his heart. How can one be instrumental in music when you're an instrument of accession, one may ask. Yet, when national chaos erupted, when the maps dissolved, when the nagging demands of civic duties stung, when the pageantry mellowed, this Maverick's inner melody reigned. In such trying times, he furiously composes a set of Carnatic classical compositions, melding harmonic ideas into Carnatic vocabulary. It was as if the poetry of Richard Strauss's Ein Bindrott, of the four last songs, were prophetic of his tussle with his times. Only two larks soar musingly into the haze, him and his inner lark. Around us, the valleys bow, the air already darkens. Only two larks soar musingly into the haze.
Historically and traditionally, the arts have enjoyed the patronage of kings. We all know that culture broadens minds. It's an important basis by which society finds expression and happiness. So, it is in the larger common good that culture has always been encouraged. It binds a society and gives it an identity and a personality, and sets up the basis for cultural interaction with other societies. People like kings patronize the arts to allow its exponents the freedom to live in their minds and pursue their muse. Dancers, musicians, artists, dramatists, and storytellers have long enjoyed the patronage of the palace. The Maharajas of Mysore, many of them, have pursued the arts themselves, the most notable among them being Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar, the last Maharaja of Mysore, before his kingdom acceded to the Union of Indian States in 1947. He was a thinker, a published philosopher, a patron of the arts. But importantly, he was a patron without bias. While there is a rich legacy of Carnatic music patronized by him, Wadiyar fulfilled the last wish of legendary composer Richard Strauss. A little known fact: in 1950, he sponsored a performance at the Royal Albert Hall by London's Philharmonia Orchestra, led by German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler and soprano Kirsten Flagstad, singing Strauss's final composition, Four Last Songs. The Maharaja, too, was an accomplished musician. Schooled in Carnatic and Western classical music, he tried to make meaning of the two forms and worked tirelessly to find a blend, later admitting that it was difficult. As a musician, I want to say that unfortunately, too many musicians have been pitiless in this pursuit. Chronicling this unusual Maharaja is my guest, Deepti Navaratna, author of an unconventionally structured biography of Wadiyar titled The Maverick Maharaja. But as I researched her, I realized that she is unusual. By my reckoning, she is a wonderful Carnatic singer and she is a neuroscientist, which means she is licensed to dissect brains in a laboratory. Scientific research is a linear and process-driven discipline, and conclusions are reached by goals and planned milestones. Surprises are not always welcome. The other side of her is music, and the point of musical composition is to defy linearity while sticking to a framework of rules and conventions. The point of music is surprise. Maybe the two are connected, and maybe it takes a maverick to make this connection. Let's find out. Here she is, joining me from my hometown, Bangalore. Deepti Navaratna, welcome to the Literary City.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
In a video once you said, I was dissecting rat brains by day and dissecting melodies by night. Now tell me about the time that you put a juju inside the rat's, what was it, main artery, cerebral cortex?
Yes, I opened up a rat's brain. This was at the Harvard University, and I was being a geek, a laboratory rat at that. And I, using a chemical maneuver, I introduced this artificial stroke as we do in the laboratory, and the rat mystically came up with a small melody of its own. It whimpered in a nice alapane, if you will, and then
Really?
at that moment, ironically, I was in crossroads, a sort of intellectual crossroads. My training was as a neuroscientist, and I had always straddled, or rather double barreled, my life. When I was a musician, but I was waiting to connect the dots within and wanting to put my heart where my brain was, and my brain where my heart was, and sort of meld these things. So up until that time, I was in some kind of an identity crisis as to, like, who I am. And it's as if in that moment when this rat sang this whimper of a melody, I I thought I had a musical stroke. It was like a stroke of genius that the rat had unleashed into my world. I said, I should really connect the dots within myself.
How was that your epiphany?
Yeah, I actually, that was the last day I walked back into the lab. I dropped my tenure track position at Harvard, uh, and I decided to sort of enroll into a world music program at the New England Conservatory, because I decided to sort of fuse my two great passions, music and science, into one interesting career configuration.
That's both unusual and interesting. Okay, let's jump straight to your book, The Maverick Maharaja. But the maverickism of which you speak is cultural, not some royal gonzo misadventure, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Tell us more.
Well, in fact, history textbooks would probably devote half a sentence to his life and say, Maharaja Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar was the last king of Mysore, and that's it. But if you take a look at the time, the place, and the attitude with which he approached the very turbulent times in which his life was lived. All of them are shining examples of will over destiny.
Explain that.
Um, for example, I'll give you this. So the passage that I read out from, when the Maharajas were, twiddling their thumbs about how to amass more wealth as they exited their princely kingdoms into the Union of India, instead this man is like furiously composing Carnatic compositions on the Devi and somewhat removed from all the chaos, because in his heart he had already accepted that democracy was coming, and he did what he wanted to do. So he didn't say, oh no, I'm being snatched off my kingdom, I'm not going to stop composing because of that.
In 1956, in response to the chief minister thanking him for making a sacrifice of giving up the throne, his response was somewhat eloquent, wasn't it?
Right. Well, he said that is an extension of the Vishwatma, right? That people should govern themselves.
Did he act upon it?
In fact, in my chapter, The Democrat in the Darbar,
Right.
there's a whole chapter dedicated to how he was the first one to invest power in the democratic apparatus that already existed in Mysore.
But this was still a kingdom.
Yes, so he was already empowering. He was already empowering people's voices. He gave them free speech. There was a cabinet of ministers who had specific portfolios. It is as if as soon as he ascended the throne, he was actually preparing Mysore to be democratic. So he was peacefully doing what he wanted to do when he wanted to do it, unaware, unfazed by external conditions. And I think that's the first sign of a maverick, is that.
Right, not much of a stretch. Moving on to culture. By your book, he was an astonishingly multicultural man. You have a line that reads, our culture is not an obstacle to participating in a plural society. So tell us about the sense of the multicultural.
Right. Well, Mysore experienced what could be called diarchy, right? It was a tussle with two political vested interests, if you can say that, and two cultures. With imperialism came the peddlers of imperial culture. In came English, European art, music, which was associated with state pageantry, right? So it was the music of power, and it was the music of authority.
Right.
And there was indigenous music, and there was Western education that came into Mysore as a consequence of colonial, imperatives, and there was indigenous Indic and indigenous knowledge systems that already existed. So what Mysore's beauty, or the shining glory moments of the story is how Mysore and its leaders is how they straddle this complicated political and social milieu to make gold out of it. They just didn't just straddle it and manage it and troubleshoot it and firefight it, but they participated in this grand alchemy of culture. And you see so many shining examples of that grand cultural alchemy, and that's the story that needs to be told and celebrated today.
As indeed it should. I can attest to being a beneficiary of this alchemy and this legacy. And Wadiyar's own musical legacy is testament to that fact, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the beauty in his story is that the fact that he loved European art music. Actually, he did not start learning Carnatic music until he was crowned as the king.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
Yes, he studied Carnatic music, in his 20s after he was crowned. His love for Western classical music did not prevent him from exploring his art that perhaps ran closer to his home. But then the fact that he was so adroitly trained in Advaita Vedanta and the philosophies of the Advaita Vedanta did not prevent him from reading a niche or a Kant or a Spinoza. And so, and somebody like him, who was actually a lesser known fact, is that he was one of the founders of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad back then. Some of the foundations of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad were laid in Mysore Palace much later. It did not prevent him from experiencing the divine in the music of a remote composer called Nikolai Metner or a Strauss, or the music of Karajan. And none of these things actually, prevented him from, his roots did not prevent him from engaging with the sensibilities and the sensorialities of the current and the West. And
You write that he was a composer. He invented ragas based on Western tonal vocabulary and by writing Carnatic compositions for Western instruments. These compositions or inventions of ragas, you say, are not merely sisters of allied Carnatic ragas, but they embody a grammar of Western, blues, and jazz music brought into the world of raga construction.
that's
But
right.
most importantly, you say this reflects well on the brave new ethos of the Mysore court.
It is very important to understand what Mysore itself managed to afford in terms of this cultural expanse. And it's not in the same, we are in a world that wants to look at cultural appropriation, cultural misappropriation, assimilation. And here is a story that's beyond all of those things. Right, it is neither of those boxes. It cannot be grouped into what happened in Mysore, the cultural transactions that happened in Mysore, the cultural transactions that are embodied in the music of the Maharaja. They do not fall into any of those boxes. And yes, his musical compositions are very poorly understood even today, simply because they are such beautiful and almost exotic, cryptic crosswords that he has played with. Uh, he's brought in a jazz tune into a raga, and he'll defy all the no existing grammars of Carnatic music to create a new raga structure. Several of his new ragas are extraordinarily weird.
Weird. How? Give me an example.
So, for example, sa ga ma pa sa pa pa ma ma ga ga re re. There's a scale that he composes which has a completely empty second half. Sa ga ma pa sa. It's so intervallic and it's born out of three chords. Basically, he takes three chords and makes a scale out of it. And what's the genius is that the kriti in which this is composed. If you didn't hear any of this and simply heard it, वन्देऽहं सदा शारदां वन्देऽहं सदा शारदां. So when bathed in that dense Sanskrit and bathed in the presentation and maneuverability that a Carnatic Kriti gives you, it masquerades really well as a good Carnatic Kriti. It's like he sort of, the presentation is so rooted in the Carnatic idiom, but the craft that lies underneath it is so deep. It is so um, alchemist, so to speak.
Captivating. Now, he was somewhat circumspect about his attempts to fuse Western and Indian music, and
Right.
I'll put it out there. Nobody has been successful. Fusion is difficult, right? I mean, it's like speaking half a sentence in one language and half in another, and then claiming that you've achieved fusion.
Yes, absolutely.
And you quote Wadiyar as saying, it's difficult. One can only make an attempt. Each system has its own inimitable features.
Exactly. And that's why I think when with each Kruti, it's as if he's testing a hypothesis, and he's dreading that tightrope walk with great sense of responsibility, because with great power and knowledge which he had comes great responsibility. He didn't want to create a hybrid, an anthropomorphic creature in music which lived nowhere. That is a decision that he made, so that we don't have these fusionary entities in his music.
Now, in your book, you mention his use of tetrachordal harmonies.
Yep.
I understand tetrachordal harmonies one way. I'm not so sure that I understand it in the way that you have used it.
Right. So I think you're referring to this raga that I talk about, the Hindola Deshika, as a case in point of the kind of innovation that went into crafting a new.
Hindolam is pentatonic, isn't it?
Yeah, sa ga ma da ni sa ni da ma ga sa is Hindola.
Right. Now, how do tetrachordal harmonies come into it?
So this raga is a very interesting hybrid in the sense that Sa ma re ga ma pa da ni sa pa ni da ma ga re ni. So this raga is born out of the jod concept of Hindustani music. So he takes that concept of jod, where one half of the raga, first tetrachord, or the first four notes of the ascending scale, is from one raga, and the second half, the second tetrachord, is from another raga.
Ah, I totally get it.
And so he didn't quite graft the Jode idea and simply make a simple hybrid.
Right.
He goes the extra mile here, because as you said, all of them, all of the compositions, all the music reeks of a pianist's mind at play,
Yes.
because he learned European art music without any influence of Carnatic music and then jumped into this. So he had a very different vantage point than others. And and he could visualize the keys on the piano. That gives a composer a great advantage. Although Carnatic music believes in Vagyakaras who are able to sing their composition and demonstrate their musical genius, the fact that we had a pianist who turned composer in Carnatic music, he could see how he could transpose an existing scale four notes above, below, and another hybrid emerges, or knock off the major third interval, and kick out the dominant chord here, and do not give it a leading tone, make a scale. So yeah, this scale that I told you about, saga ma pa sa sa pa pa ma ma ga ga re re,
Mm-hmm.
he did not want a leading tone in the ascending scale. That was his thing.
Wow.
Let's put the entropy and the traction in the first half of the scale. So he thought of these things in very different ways than a normal Carnatic composer will approach it.
My listeners may excuse me for straying into the technical over here, but I had to find out when you said
Right,
tetrachordal harmonies, my mind goes in a different direction, right?
right, right.
Fascinating to know nonetheless. Now, you mentioned that his palace was like a museum of instruments. Two specifically I'd like to talk about, the theremin and the calliope. Now, the calliope was an obnoxious, loud instrument, wasn't it?
Yes, the anecdotal evidence is that the orchestra used these instruments as showstoppers, and here's this very unwieldy, gaudy looking thing that it doesn't even look like an instrument, and they would wheel it into the middle of the stage and have it do a solo and things like that.
Poor audience. There's a huge controversy about the pronunciation, isn't there? Calliope or calliope?
Yeah.
I found a ditty that explains it. Want to
Hmm.
hear it?
Yep.
Proud folks stare after me, call me Calliope. Tooting joy, tooting hope, I am the Calliope.
Ooh, that needs to be recorded for posterity.
It is on this podcast.
Oh, wow.
Now let's talk about how you describe him to be a king and a maverick. You have this line in your book to describe him. You said that he was more oxytocin than testosterone.
Yes.
Please, as a neuroscientist, explain what you meant.
Well, yes, sort of this grand imagery of a king is like, the one with the sword, and really somebody whose pen is really not is not mightier than his sword, right? So how much land he amassed and how much of bravado he could bring in to his administration. But in here, the leadership, we in the life of the Maharaja, we find leadership of a very different kind, which is usually unsung. And that also, in a complicated political milieu, the fact that he was able to lead the way and create a society that embodied a very, very progressive ethos, uh, that is cultural leadership of a very different kind. It is also kingly, and but we don't often, kings are not praised for being a patron of the arts. In fact, historically, they are looked down upon. So, many people have told me, well, he had a lot of free time on his hands, and I'm sure he took to writing and listening to music, because what was he to do, right? And so all of those sniggers and naysayers have it handy to sort of portray kings as, right. So the oxytocin, right? So oxytocin is not seen as a hormonal requirement in the in the kingly hormonal paraphernalia.
That's funny. Now, in his sunset years, after accession to the Union of Indian States, he was appointed Raja Pramukh of Karnataka, governor of Karnataka. But before long, he became very disillusioned with the way things were going in politics in India. And you say he wanted to quit.
Absolutely. In fact, it's a Greek tragedy in its essence, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, he saw many large transformations of power in his life, and he had to reign Mysore through perhaps what is the most significant and turbulent times for both Mysore and India, with the Quit India movement, the Second World War, the birthing of India, formation of the Indian Dominion, and he still continued as a sovereign of Mysore till 1950. It is only then that he melded Mysore with the Indian Republic, and then became the Raj Pramukh. And then, in fact, and this was all by the time he turned 30. So he was the governor. He had been, when Mysore exited his world, he was only 30. So his life had, just begun in a new kind of a significance. In terms of acceptance, he was quite okay with it, but the political tomfoolery that existed and continues to exist in Karnataka must have completely disillusioned him. In fact, he's a huge misfit to the whole dynamic.
I'd imagine. Completely.
Very
Completely.
trying times, and the very end of his life was very tragic.
More's the pity. But you've brought his legacy to life in a very wonderful way.
Oh, thank you for noting that.
Well, now before I let you go, a final question. Your work as a scientist included doing some research on diabetes. So, have you found the cure?
Well, the perfect antidote to all things mortal is music.
Well said. You couldn't have left this better. So, Deepti Navaratna, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Wonderful speaking with you, and we got carried away into so many beautiful alleys of conversation. It's not very often that this also happens as a consequence of for conversation. Thank you so much.
And that was Deepti Navaratna, author of The Maverick Maharaja, a wonderful biography about Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar, the last Maharaja of Mysore. And there's a link in the podcast description to where you can and must buy that book. And I'll be back with What's That Word? That fun segment where we look at words and phrases that we use all the time but never stop to think about. And I'm back with What's That Word? And to help me with it is my co host. And as always, I will let her introduce herself. Take it away.
Hello, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello, PE, and then an A. How's it going today?
Hey, I enjoyed Deepti Navaratna. She is super articulate, a musician, a neurosurgeon, an author.
And she sings beautifully.
Captivating, as you said. And hey, I left out historian.
Right, that too. Say, we've been doing a lot of history-based books lately, haven't we?
Yes, starting with William Dalrymple, and almost all of them in the last few episodes.
Well, those authors have our school history textbooks to thank for their success. Taught us little and created a demand for them.
Yeah, yes, ironically.
And we have not done a home episode before, have we?
Yeah, nothing about Bangalore, no. And books like The Maverick Maharaja teach me about my own history, that I only knew partially.
Like?
Like, for example, I learned a lot about Wadiyar's musical side. And hearing about the amount of political upheaval this king had to go through, leading all the way up to giving up his kingdom, and he was only 30 years old.
Yes, it's true, right? Quite a guy, all this in his 20s. Again, blame your school history textbooks for killing your enthusiasm.
I do. You're right. And this obsession with just passing exams kills any curiosity.
Which is why many of us can rattle off the names of all the great Mughals from Babur to Aurangzeb, but only have a passing idea of the lineage of South Indian history, for instance.
Hey, guilty.
It's not your fault.
Thank you.
This once.
Hey.
Anyway, read the Maverick Maharaja and get your local history fix.
I plan to.
It's great to read about Bangalore. Through what happened years ago, everything seemed so much more civil.
Yes, seriously. And there's less and less to be proud of in Bangalore these days.
We fix that by reminiscing about those days. But let me tell you, having spoken to a few people, in those days, they used to reminisce about days that were those days to them.
Nostalgia. Hey, I really like that line you'd once written about nostalgia.
Which one?
Nostalgia is not what it used to be.
Ah, yes. But sadly, I can't take credit. I can't claim that I wrote that. I merely typed it.
Then who did?
Well, last I checked, etymologists agreed that it was from a novel by Peter de Vries titled The Tents of Wickedness. De Vries was a humorist who worked for the New Yorker and wrote many books.
What was that title again?
The Tents of Wickedness.
Tents as in Tents?
Yes.
Oh no. Okay, no frat boy jokes, please.
I didn't make a frat boy joke. You just made one, not I. Okay, P with an A, what's that word?
Easy. Maverick.
There you go.
Okay, let's go. Meaning and etymology.
Okay, you know the commonly used meaning of the word, don't you?
Yeah, I guess it would be a person who does things differently, from the way others usually do, not really following rules and conventions.
Quite right. An unorthodox or independent-minded person is one dictionary definition, but same thing essentially.
Yeah, and that's how Deepti used the word in her title.
Quite right, correct.
And what's the root of the word, the etymology?
Okay, maverick is really an eponym, which is a word that comes from the proper name of a person or a place, right?
Yes.
And the original meaning of maverick was unbranded cattle.
Really? That comes as a surprise. Tell me more.
As an eponym, it goes back to the mid-1800s. The word comes from the name of a Texas cattle rancher, Samuel Augustus Maverick. Now, Maverick was notorious for not branding his cattle and just letting them roam unbranded.
Interesting. So how did unbranded cattle come to be called mavericks? I mean, how did that stay?
So in 1885, and this was 15 years after Samuel Maverick had died, there was an amendment to the relevant law in the state of Colorado in the US, which read, all livestock found running at large in this state without a mother, and upon which there is neither mark nor brand, shall be deemed a maverick.
Again, that's interesting. But explain the word association with a nonconformist.
Okay, as it turns out, Maverick did not brand his cattle because he was too lazy to brand all his cattle. But everyone thought that his decision not to brand them was pioneering and awfully courageous. So his name came to be applied to both independently minded people and cattle.
And does the name itself have an etymology?
Well, it does actually. One set of etymologists believe that maverick is from the Welsh Maurice or Moric, which means valiant hero. A competing etymology proposes a more biblical connection, the Hebrew word maverick, which means shiny or brilliant.
Ah, but I was hoping that Samuel Maverick did not brand his cattle by choice, not laziness. I mean, branding is so cruel. I thought maybe he was more woke.
Well, it is not clear if Samuel Maverick was or wasn't woke, but his grandson certainly was. Ran in the family, I guess.
How so?
Samuel's grandson, Maury Maverick, was a Democrat congressman in 1935. In fact, and he was very woke, and refused to fall for racial or economic prejudices of the day. For example, he was the only Southern congressman to vote for the federal anti-lynching bill. Not only did he vote for it, but he made a speech on the floor of the House supporting the anti-lynching bill.
Wow. He was a maverick, I guess.
In name and spirit.
Yeah. But how crazy that lynching was not against the law even in 1935 in the US. There's one thing that must not make it to anyone's nostalgia.
Quite right, except as a terrible lesson of history. Anywho, back to Maverick. Can you name another famous maverick?
Yes! And it's been on my mind through this entire segment.
Really? Who? Name him. You have one guess.
Hey, Maverick is Tom Cruise's character in Top Gun.
Right, and with good reason, I guess. You know, the new Top Gun is in the theaters as we speak.
I know, and if we have finished speaking, that's where I'm headed.
We have. Go. Or, in the words of Samuel Maverick, git.
Bye.
And that is our show. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. I'd like to thank my guest, Deepti Navaratna, and my co-host, Pranati P with an A, Madhav. Now, before you go, I'd like you to head over to wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast and hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of The Literary City. Have fun and see you again next Wednesday.